Scott. You ever look at a regular map of the world and just think about how kind of wild the concept of a border actually is,
Oh, yeah, constantly.
right? Because it's often just, a line drawn on a piece of paper or maybe some invisible boundary running through a river or a desert. But if you step just one single inch across that line, your entire legal destiny, your rights, everything can completely change.
Yeah, I mean, it is entirely arbitrary in a physical sense, right?
Right.
But it's profoundly absolute in a legal sense. Just a few inches of dirt can literally be the difference between belonging to a nation and, well, being a complete outsider with zero guaranteed protections.
Exactly. And that invisible line is really the absolute center of today's deep dive into the high-stakes world of constitutional law.
It's a big one today.
It really is. So for you listening, we're looking at source material from a legal show called Constitution today, and it unpacks one of the most consequential, heavily gifted concepts in American history, which is birthright citizenship.
Right.
So our mission today is to explore for you where this rule came from, like why it was created in the first place, and how one specific sentence, written all the way back in 1868, continues to shape modern immigration policy and, the very limits of presidential power.
Yeah, it's this topic that basically bridges the immediate aftermath of the Civil War directly to, like, today's breaking news alerts. It's wild.
Just a quick heads up before we get into the weeds here. This source material touches on highly charged modern debates. We're talking immigration, executive orders, very conflicting interpretations of the Constitution.
Right. Very sensitive stuff.
Yeah, so our goal today is definitely not to take a side or endorse any viewpoint. We're just here to act as your guides, impartially laying out the historical facts and the exact arguments that both sides are using. So you have the context to understand the headlines. We're conveying the ideas just as they appear in the source material.
Right, because, I mean, understanding the foundation of those modern political arguments requires us to really look at the legal mechanics of the past, right? Objectively and thoroughly.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Okay.
So to understand the modern debate over who gets to be a citizen, we first have to understand the historical trauma that basically forced the creation of this specific citizenship rule.
Yeah, we have to go back quite a bit.
We do. We're talking about birthright citizenship, which essentially means that, with a few very narrow exceptions, any person born on American soil automatically becomes a United States citizen.
Right, yeah. In legal terms, this is often referred to as just soli, or, right of the soil.
Right of the soil, okay.
Yeah, meaning you are born within the physical borders of the country, therefore you are a citizen of that country. And it contrasts with jus sanguinis, which is right of blood, where your citizenship is determined by the citizenship of your parents, completely regardless of where you're physically born.
Got it. And I understand why the U.S. operates on that right of the soil rule. The source points out that we really have to go back to 1857 and look at one of the most, infamous Supreme Court decisions in history, which is Dred Scott.
Ugh, yes, Dred Scott.
Yeah. The court ruled that Black Americans, even if they were born free on American soil, could never become citizens. But it's the legal mechanism the court used that is just so crucial to understand here.
Right, the logic they used.
Exactly. Chief Justice Roger Taney basically argued that the Constitution was never intended to include Black people in the political community.
Yeah.
He explicitly rejected the right of the soil for them, arguing instead that citizenship was, strictly tied to a specific ancestral bloodline.
Yeah, Taney effectively ruled that constitutional rights were based on ancestry, not geography. I mean, he declared that an entire group of people were permanent aliens in their own birthplace.
Which is just staggering to think about.
It is. The mechanism of that decision created a literal caste system. It legally stripped away the possibility of belonging based on where you were born, and it just handed that power over to the subjective judgment of the courts and politicians. They got to decide whose bloodline was worthy.
Right. It created an existential crisis about who actually belonged to the American project. And as the source highlights, this decision severely deepened national divisions and acted as a major catalyst that, propelled the nation right into the Civil War.
Exactly.
So the country goes to war with itself, the Union wins, slavery is abolished. But Congress realizes they can't just leave the definition of a citizen up to interpretation anymore. They have to permanently dismantle the legal mechanism of the Dred Scott decision.
Precisely. Post-war Congress wanted an absolute guarantee that no future government and no future Supreme Court could ever again use that bloodline argument to deny citizenship to formerly enslaved people.
They needed to lock it down.
Yeah, completely. So they proposed the 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868.
Right.
And To ensure we get the mechanics of this exactly right, let me just quote the specific source text.
Yeah, please do.
It says, quote, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States.
Okay, so that's the core sentence.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is the brilliance of its omissions. Like, if you look closely at what the amendment doesn't say, you realize how revolutionary it was.
Oh, interesting. What do you mean?
Well, it doesn't mention race, it doesn't mention religion, it doesn't mention national origin or ancestry anywhere. Its entire purpose was to establish a sweeping constitutional rule based strictly on geographic birth to protect formerly enslaved people.
Man, it's like Congress was pressing a constitutional hard reset button.
That's a really good way to put it.
Yeah, because before the Civil War, citizenship was basically this exclusive club with a highly subjective bouncer, the Supreme Court, right, who could bounce you out based on your ancestry.
Right, exactly.
But by passing the 14th Amendment and anchoring citizenship strictly to the physical dirt you're born on, they basically fired the bouncer.
They absolutely did.
They made citizenship a mechanical, undeniable geographic fact. Just, you're born here. Boom, reset. You are a citizen. Imagine the immense power of that single sentence stabilizing a fractured post-war nation.
Firing the subjective bouncer is such a great analogy. The intent was to stabilize a deeply fractured country by creating a baseline geographic truth that just couldn't be argued with. It took the question of citizenship totally away from political preferences and anchored it to the physical soil.
Okay, so the 14th Amendment was explicitly written to protect formerly enslaved people. But it didn't take long for the country to face a massive new wave of immigration from, entirely different parts of the world.
Right, the demographics were shifting rapidly.
Yeah, which creates an immediate friction point. Like, how does this new hard reset rule handle people that the authors of the amendment might not have been directly thinking about in 1868?
Which forces the legal system to really test the absolute boundaries of this geographic rule.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Because the source brings up an 1898 landmark case called United States v. Wong Kim Ark.
A huge, huge case.
Right, so we hit the late 19th century, and Wong Kim Ark is born in San Francisco. But he is born to Chinese immigrant parents. Now, the crucial context here is the Chinese Exclusion Act and, other highly discriminatory laws of the era.
Yeah, which made his parents entirely ineligible to ever become American citizens.
Right, the government was actively trying to prevent assimilation. So Wong Kim Ark takes a trip overseas, and when he tries to return home to San Francisco,
the U.S. government denies him re-entry.
Wow. And I'm imagining the government used his parents' ineligible status as a weapon to lock him out, right? Like, they basically tried to resurrect a version of the Dred Scott bloodline logic.
They did, yeah.
Arguing that because his parents couldn't be citizens, that lack of status somehow cascaded down to him, despite him being born in California.
That is exactly the argument they made. I mean, the government's lawyers argued all about political allegiance. They claimed that because his parents were subjects of the Emperor of China, Wong Kim Ark inherited that political allegiance through his bloodline.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so therefore, he wasn't truly a U.S. citizen, regardless of the soil he was physically born on. But Wong's defense was purely mechanical. He was just like, I was born here, I follow the laws here, the 14th Amendment says I'm a citizen.
So the Supreme Court steps in, and they have to draw a hard line between the right of blood and the right of soil.
There.
And they side with the soil.
They absolutely did.
The court ruled in Wong Kim Ark's favor, declaring that simply because he was born in the U.S., he was automatically a citizen under the 14th Amendment, regardless of his parents' legal status or national origin. It's wild when you think about the timeline.
What do you mean?
Well, just think about it for you listening.
Yeah.
How wild is it that an 1898 dispute about a guy just trying to get back to San Francisco from a trip overseas remains the undisputed cornerstone of birthright citizenship over a century later?
It really is incredible. And it was a massive rejection of the bloodline argument. That specific case took the 14th Amendment and cemented its broad application way, way beyond its original post-Civil War purpose.
Right.
It proved that the words all persons born in the United States were a mechanical rule. It set a precedent that has governed American immigration and identity for well over 100 years now.
So Wong Kim Ark seemingly settles the whole soil versus blood argument for over a century. But of course, that brings us right to the doorstep of the modern controversy.
Because it's never fully settled, is it?
Exactly, because today's intense political debates don't usually focus on the first half of that sentence.
Okay.
All persons born in the United States.
Right.
The entire modern flashpoint zeroes in on the remaining 7 words, which are, quote, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof.
Yes. The entire debate today is just this fierce linguistic battle over what the word jurisdiction meant in 1868 and, how it should be applied today. The source actually outlines 2 deeply divided camps on how to interpret that single phrase.
Okay, let's break down the underlying mechanics of this jurisdiction debate, because it's not just semantics here. The pro-change camp, the people arguing that automatic birthright citizenship shouldn't apply to everyone, they're essentially arguing of the difference between territorial obedience and true political allegiance, right?
Correct, yeah. The argument for changing the interpretation relies on the idea that subject to the jurisdiction requires a deep, formal legal allegiance to the United States.
Okay.
So supporters of this view argue that if someone comes to the U.S. unlawfully or maybe on a very temporary visa, they still owe their ultimate political allegiance to their home country.
That makes sense from their perspective.
Right. Therefore, they argue, those parents are not truly subject to the jurisdiction of the U.S. in a political sense, and their children shouldn't automatically receive citizenship just because they were born on U.S. soil. They actually argue the current policy encourages illegal immigration by creating an incentive to cross the border.
Okay, so that camp views jurisdiction as complete political loyalty.
Huh.
But the status quo camp, like the opponents of making this change, how do they define jurisdiction mechanically?
Well, the opponents of the change rely on the concept of territorial jurisdiction. They argue that subject to the jurisdiction simply means that you have to obey U.S. laws while you are physically standing on U.S. soil.
Right.
To give an example from the source, if a foreign tourist is visiting New York and robs a bank, the NYPD doesn't care what passport they hold, right?
No, definitely not.
They are subject to the jurisdiction of the local police and courts. Therefore, this camp argues, anyone born on U.S. soil is subject to its laws, and under the 14th Amendment and, a century of Supreme Court precedent like Wong Kim Ark, their children are automatically citizens. Yeah, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, it is just astonishing how monumental legal shifts things that dictate the destinies of millions of families and the demographic future of a nation often hinge entirely on the interpretation of a single word like jurisdiction and competing historical definitions from the 19th century.
It really is. But this is actually where I kind of have to push back a little on the popular concept of settled law.
Okay, let's hear it.
Because you hear politicians and court nominees use that phrase all the time to suggest a topic is completely closed. But this entire jurisdiction debate proves to you that the Constitution is constantly being relitigated.
Very true.
Every new generation takes a magnifying glass to the exact same text. Just because the Supreme Court drew a line in the sand in 1898 doesn't mean a new generation won't look at the words subject to the jurisdiction and say, well, wait a minute, we think the historical intent meant something entirely different.
That is the reality of a living adversarial legal system. Nothing is ever truly immune to being challenged again. And, the intense linguistic and political debate we're talking about didn't just stay a theoretical argument in law school classrooms.
Oh, no.
It eventually escalated into direct executive action.
Right. The theoretical debate crossed right over into real-world application. The source highlights that President Trump issued an executive order that attempted to bypass Congress and directly change how the government interprets that constitutional sentence.
Yeah. According to the source, the executive order specifically sought to instruct federal agencies to deny automatic citizenship to children born in the U.S. if their parents were undocumented immigrants or if they were in the country temporarily under certain visa categories.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a direct, practical application of that alternative interpretation of the jurisdiction clause we just discussed.
And mechanically, an executive order is a tool a president can use to direct the operations of the federal government rapidly, often bypassing the incredibly slow gridlock of Congress.
Yeah.
But doing this on a constitutional issue immediately triggered a massive separation of powers clash, didn't it?
It did. It triggered an immediate structural friction between the branches of government. The source objectively outlines this clash, right? So on one side, supporters of the executive order argued that the president was entirely within his Article 2 executive rights.
Okay.
They viewed the broad application of birthright citizenship as a long-standing, mistaken interpretation of the 14th Amendment. And they felt the executive branch had a duty to correct that error in how the law was being enforced.
But the critics immediately pointed out a massive roadblock, which is the century-old precedent sitting in the Supreme Court and, well, the amendment process itself.
Exactly. The critics argued that a president absolutely cannot change the definition of birthright citizenship unilaterally via an executive order.
Right, because of the structure.
Right. Their argument is structural. Because this is a core constitutional issue backed by over 100 years of legal precedent, only two mechanisms could make such a fundamental change.
Which are?
Either Congress and 3/4 of the states have to pass a brand new constitutional amendment under Article 5, or the Supreme Court has to issue a new decision officially overturning the precedent they set back in Wong Kim Ark.
Yeah, so they argued one person in the Oval Office just doesn't have the authority to alter the 14th Amendment.
Precisely.
It's a classic high-stakes clash.
Yeah.
The executive branch saying, hey, we are fixing a historical misinterpretation, and the critics saying, you do not have the structural authority to bypass the Supreme Court or the constitutional amendment process.
Right.
Which leaves us waiting for the final arbiter. Like, how does the Supreme Court actually handle this specific clash?
Well, it's so funny. The source material builds up perfectly to that climax, right? The podcast host in the transcript asks the legal professor, well, what did the Supreme Court decide?
Yes. And the professor starts to answer. He says, quote, that depends on which decision you're referring to. In the court's 2020, and then the transcript just completely cuts off.
Literally mid-sentence.
Mid-sentence. We get this huge cliffhanger right at the absolute most crucial moment of the source text.
It's so frustrating, but also kind of perfect.
So what does this all mean? We have this incredible historical buildup, this massive constitutional clash over the separation of powers, and then a cutoff transcript. Where does that actually leave us?
Well, this raises an important question, right? And honestly, the accidental cutoff in the source text makes a profound point all on its own.
How so?
It reminds you that constitutional law isn't a finished history book sitting on a dusty library shelf somewhere. It is a living, breathing, and completely unresolved narrative.
Wow, yeah.
The final chapters of this debate are quite literally still being written right now in the 2020s. We don't have the neat and tidy final ruling in front of us because the American legal system is always in motion. It's always reacting to the next challenge.
That is such a great way to look at it. The cutoff isn't just an error. It's literally a reflection of reality. The debate is ongoing. So let's just take a breath and recap this incredible legal journey we've just been on with this source material.
Let's do it.
We started in the darkest days of the 1850s, looking at the legal mechanism of the Dred Scott decision, which tore the country apart by legally restricting citizenship to ancestry and bloodline.
Right. Then we moved to the aftermath of the Civil War, where Congress basically fired the subjective bouncer. They implemented a constitutional hard reset with the 14th Amendment, creating a one-sentence geographic rule for citizenship based strictly on the soil you were born on, specifically to protect the formerly enslaved.
And from there, we watched that mechanical rule get tested in the real world in 1898 with Wong Kim Ark. The Supreme Court rejected the government's attempt to bring back bloodline logic and cemented the idea that if you were born on U.S. soil, you are a citizen, period, setting a precedent that lasted well over a century.
Only to arrive at the modern era, where that exact same century-old precedent is facing fierce new linguistic battles over the definition of jurisdiction. A debate over political allegiance versus territorial obedience, escalating all the way to presidential executive orders and, well, a cliffhanger constitutional showdown.
It's a stark reminder that the laws governing who gets to proudly call themselves an American are not carved permanently in stone.
No, not at all.
They're constantly being tested, pulled at, and debated by every new generation.
Yeah.
And those debates directly impact the actual physical makeup of the country you live in today.
Exactly. The definition of who belongs to the state is just always under construction.
Which leaves me with one final thought I really want to throw your way. Something for you to ponder on your own after you finish listening.
Oh, I love these.
Yeah, so we started this deep dive talking about maps, right? And how arbitrary a physical line in the dirt can be. For the last 150 years, American citizenship has been anchored almost entirely to that dirt, to the geographic physical act of being born on a specific patch of land. But look at the world we are moving into.
Right, a world that is changing technologically faster than the law could ever hope to keep up with.
Exactly. I mean, we are living in an increasingly borderless digital era. We have digital nomads, decentralized network states, and we're looking at futures that involve, like, prolonged space stations, or maybe even interplanetary colonization.
Which sounds like sci-fi, but it's coming.
It's coming. So
Yeah.
if the very core of our citizenship and our legal identity is so fiercely tied to physical geography, have to evolve when physical location means less and less.
That's a wild thought.
Right. When a line in the sand is replaced by a digital footprint, or when the hospital you were born in is orbiting a completely different planet entirely, what will it mean to legally belong to a nation then? Will we have to invent an entirely new legal mechanism?
It's definitely a question the authors of the 14th Amendment could never have possibly imagined in 1868, but one the next generation is undoubtedly going to have to answer.
The map is always changing. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.